power that we find in them. Will Schwab will discuss how books can get people through life, and he will be joined by Thai novelist Kun Pim Wangtechawat, publisher Edmund Wee, and fiction and non-fiction author Emma Larkin. Please give a warm welcome to all of our speakers.
So, hello everybody. Oh, I was wondering, I thought maybe we were going to have to talk over the music. I was anxious. My name is Will Schwalbe, and welcome to the panel titled Books for Living. My second memoir was called Books for Living, so I'm particularly delighted to be moderating this. And as we come near to the end of the festival, I just wanted to give one more shout out to the extraordinary festival volunteers, and organizers, Nalan, Melinda, and Natasha. So what I'm going to do is read little bios of everybody and then launch into some questions. Emma Larkin, all the way to my left, is the author of the nonfiction book Finding George Orwell in Burma, which is in part a book about books, as it explores Myanmar through the pages of Orwell's novels. She was raised in Bangkok and, in fact, learned to read and love books in this very room. So she's been visiting the Neilson Haze ever since she first began to read. Her first novel, Comrade Aeon's Field Guide to Bangkok, was published a couple of years ago and is effectively an ode in book form to the city in which she grew up. Edmund Wee is the founder of Epigram Books, an independent trade publisher in Singapore. It was established in 2012 to champion Singapore literature and is best known for its multi-award-winning graphic novel, The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chi by Sunny Liu, which has been translated into 10 languages, including Thai. It also organizes the annual Epigram Books Fiction Prize, the manuscript competition that is open to all writers in Southeast Asia. Prior to publishing, Edmund was in communications design, and in 2008 was named Designer of the Year in the President's Design Awards, Singapore's highest design awards. He was a psychologist and journalist in previous life. And Ping Wangtechawat is a Thai-Chinese writer from Bangkok. She graduated with distinction from Edinburgh's Napier University in Scotland with a Master in Creative Writing. Her debut novel, The Moon Represents My Heart, was published by One World Publications in the UK in June 2023, and television rights were sold after a competitive auction to 21 Laps and Netflix, with actress Gemma Chan set to star and produce. I can't wait for that. I have to tell you, not in the case of Edmund, who's a publisher, but in the case of Emma and in the case of Pim, I have recently visited or revisited their books. If you haven't, you must. These are astonishing works. What does Books for Living mean? Well, in one sense, maybe it's the books that we find when we need them that tell us what we need to know and do in our lives. So I'm going to start with a very obvious question, which has to do with the books that were most influential in our panelists' lives, both when they were children and later in life, and also a broader question, which is, do you think a book can save a life? And I'm going to start with Emma.
Yeah, so it's quite a big one, isn't it? I think I'll start backwards, I guess. I think books saving lives, absolutely. I don't think I can think of a specific book that has saved my life, but I can't imagine my life without books. Like the reverse of it. I was trying to, actually, on thinking about this panel, I was thinking, I just couldn't imagine not having the ability to turn to books and to stories for companionship and for solace and for humor and entertainment and all that stuff, and the worlds they open up, right? I can't imagine that not being part of my life. So if I don't have a specific book, I would say, I think generally, right, books can save lives. Do you want me to be specific about books? Okay. I was thinking about this, and I think it would change if you asked me on any given day. So today, the book that I find most important in my life is a book called Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada. I don't know if anyone's read it. It was given to me by my editor about 10 years ago, and it was unusual because normally editors give you books from their own publishing house, right? It's freebies and they give them out. But this was a book she specifically went out and got for me from a different publisher. And it actually took me a while to get around to reading it, but it's an incredible book. It was written in a fever pitch in 1946 in Berlin. It was written in 2 months. It's a grand, sweeping novel about a couple, Otto Pangl and his wife Anna, and they live in Nazi Germany, and they're determined to do something about it, but they're little people. And so what they do is they write on postcards, and they deliver these postcards to certain members of the Nazi regime. And they do it in secret, because if they get caught, they will get killed. And there's a Gestapo investigator following their trail. And it's an amazing caper across all of Berlin. But what sticks with me about the book is that he, Otto, doesn't know if anybody's reading his postcards. Right? This is this one little thing he can do against the Third Reich, you know? Is anybody reading these little messages that I've put on little squares? He doesn't know. And he does it anyway. And I think that's just such a interesting moral lesson about how to be good and how to be true to yourself. And not every book will do that, obviously, and I'm not even sure I thought that specifically as I was reading the book, but it's the thing I took away from the book. And I think that's quite interesting with books, right? You don't always know what the lesson is or the takeaway is, and sometimes it bubbles up, you know, years later. So that, for me, would be my most important book today.
Thank you. And Edmund?
Hello. In my first year of university, I read a book called The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. I was so moved by it. It affected me so much. I went to read her second book, Atlas Shrugged. And very soon after that, I had to read lots of books because I was at university. And I read a book called The Denial of Death. And I would say that these 3 books saved my life. I was on the way to becoming thinking of going to become a priest, you know, or a pastor, you know, joining the religious life. And I read these 3 books, and I didn't, you know. So that saved my life. But the 3 books had a great impact on my thinking at a very young age. I was about maybe 18, 19, maybe no more than 20. And those 3 books really told me that I had to live a life of principle. The books are all about, Fountainhead is about a man who designed a building, and then it was built not according to his specification, and then he put a bomb and blew down the whole building, and then had to go to jail because Atlas Shrugged is about 3 guys who rail against the system, and Denial of Death is a non-fiction book. I think it's still in print after 50 years, right? It's all about leaving a legacy. It's all about living a life that is a principled life, and not, what somebody else tells you to live your life. And I think after that, I have tried to live a life in this way. So So those were the 3 books that I think changed my life, saved my life.
And Pim,
Firstly, thank you so much to everyone for being here. Also, coming to the books, I feel like my books are so different from the books that you mentioned. So when I was young, I loved to read like a lot. I would read all the time when I was eating, when I was walking in malls, when I was with like my parents and with their friends. I read so much that my parents had to sit me down at one point and told me like, oh, you can't read all the time, it's rude. So the books that I loved growing up are so different from yours. I read The Lord of the Rings, I read The Chronicles of Narnia, I read Harry Potter, I read Little Women. I read a lot of like classics translated into Thai. So I read like The Famous Five, I read The Secret Garden, I read, what else did I read? Yeah, those like main ones. Oh, Little House on the Prairie for some reason. They were all translated into Thai, and I would go to C-Ed Books. I don't know if you guys know that, C-Ed Books, and I would go to this translated section, and I would just read so many of the books from that section. And to answer your question, I don't think there's, like Emma said, I don't think there's one specific book that saved my life, but I felt like those books really, even though now that I'm an adult, I look back and think, oh, there are definitely some issues with some of the books. But I do feel like they really shaped me into who I am as a person and what I want to do with my life. I think maybe there's not one specific book that saved me, but I think the books helping me dream beyond my circumstances is saving in a way. Like maybe it doesn't it shows me that there's a different world out there, or there are different kinds of people out there, and there are maybe different kinds of identities that, like kind of basic characters that I looked up to. And I think even though as a child you don't have the pathway of how to get there, but knowing that that's a possibility, or that those worlds are out there I find that very powerful.
I want to follow up on that just for a second with you. As we were talking, you have the most gloriously eclectic group of influences that you've named that range from the poetry of Ada Limon and Mary Oliver to Doctor Who to the films of Wong Kar-wai to some of the books you mentioned like Little Women. I'm curious, what is different, if anything, about the experience of reading books than ingesting influences in other ways through, for example, film for you?
I think it's all, for me, I just see it all as storytelling, kind of. And I think it's just different mediums of storytelling. I think, and there are pros and cons to each medium. And for me, as a person, I used to write a lot of film criticism. And I think I enjoy films. What I don't get from books is that I get immersed in books, but with films it's a different kind of immersion because you see, I don't know how to explain it. It's just a different kind of medium and you just get swept up in it in different ways. So I just love storytelling in general. So I love books, I love films, TV shows, even music. I'm a big fan of lyrical hip hop. I know this might be a wild shout, but Kendrick Lamar, Good Kid, Mad City, that entire album is a day in the life of a person in one day. And that entire album can be seen as basically like storytelling, that entire album. And so I even like watch Love Island, which is kind of very different. Some people might call that storytelling as well. So yeah, I just see it all as storytelling and you get different stuff from different mediums.
Emma, as a child, were there some books that were particularly important to you?
Yeah, they're probably all still here, actually. I was thinking about this too, and I read a lot of the Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia and all that stuff. But the one that I think really resonated with me was The Borrowers. I don't know if anybody's read that.
Yes, I love that.
And I was trying to think why all these amazing books, like Lions and Wardrobes and all that sort of stuff. And The Borrowers, for those who don't know, is about little people who live under the floorboard. And they collect all the things that we lose, the little thimble or matchbox, and they make their whole life from things that we've discarded and lost. And I think why it resonated so much was it's a parallel universe in your own world, right? So everything's normal, but there are these little people who live under the floorboards. And I just thought in terms of the imagination, it just awoke me to the idea that there are these possibilities for other worlds. I read the whole series. I think there's like Borrowers Aloft and Borrowers Afloat, and it was written in the 1950s. And speaking to your thought on different mediums, I think books are so intimate, right? I mean, there's this little portal between me and Mary, what's her name? Norton, is it? Yeah. In 1952, right? And then here I am decades later, somehow inside her head and her imagination, and there's a magic to it, right? I think that this is maybe more intimate than you get with film or something like that, I find.
It's interesting. We're going to come back to that because Pims is a novel of time travel, and books, as you mentioned, are a form of time travel. Edmund, as a child, were there books that spoke to you, or did you discover reading later?
Oh, I grew up just after the war, so there was hardly anything to read. So I didn't read as a child very much. I only started reading when I went to university. When I say reading, I mean reading fiction. So I want to say something about reading fiction and why you should read fiction, and I'm sure you all do. I'm convinced, and I'm because it's happened to me, and I'm convinced it will happen to everyone. Great literature will change your life. But even if it's not great literature, if you read, when you read fiction, four things happen. Whether you are aware of it or not, but four things happen when you read literature, fiction. First, you put yourself into the shoes of somebody because you are following the story of a character. So you have to get into their world. In doing so, you become more empathetic. And by being more empathetic, you end up being kinder. I'm quite sure. Number two, the second thing that happens when you read fiction is that you have to follow a complex story. Right? It's not a 140-word tweet. You have to follow a plot. Sometimes there's a twist. Sometimes you get lost and you have to go back and figure it out again, and then you continue the story. So you are involved in a long, complex story. And when you do that, I think you become wiser. The other two things that happen when you read fiction is that you always read fiction alone. I mean, you can't read fiction with somebody else. I know there are book clubs, but you have to read it first when you're reading fiction. You are reading by yourself. There's nobody else around you. And it's so important in this day and age that you learn to be comfortable with yourself. When you learn to be comfortable with yourself, you develop self-confidence. And the last thing, well, maybe the fourth thing, maybe there are fifth other things that I'm not aware of. But the fourth thing that happens when you read a novel is that you read a novel in silence. You can't read a novel in a disco. I did bring a novel to the F1 race in Singapore and was never invited back again. But I found it very boring with the cars going round and round, and I'm glad I brought a novel, so I read. But for most of the time when you read a novel, you are reading in silence. Some people have some music on, but by and large you curl up, in the couch and you read in silence. And it's so important in this day and age that you are comfortable with being quiet, that you are comfortable, in silence. Because in that process, you also develop mental well-being. So without knowing it, when you read fiction, these four things happen to you. And that's why you must read. Even if the book is not so great, it doesn't change your life, these four things are happening to you. And these four things will make you wiser, kinder, more self-confident, and being much better mental well-being.
I wish an engraver were on hand so we could put that on a plaque and hang it over the library.
Actually, this idea came from reading a passage written by Anne Patchett. those of you who have read her. She has written a book quite some time ago called This is the Story of a Happy Marriage. It has something to do with her second marriage, but a lot of the book has to do with writing. And in it, she says, this is what happens to you. I mean, in a much more poetic form. I'm just elaborating.
So, and I'm going to read that quote later, which you provided. Speaking of quotes, there was a quote that I wanted you all to react to. And I'm going to ask Emma about it first. And it's a quote from the American writer James Baldwin. And the quote is, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read, it was books that taught me that the things that most tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive who had ever been alive." Emma, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, very beautifully put. Absolutely, it's that lonesome no longer feeling, right, that you get when a character in a novel speaks to you, I think. There's one book I reread fairly frequently, which is Wuthering Heights. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's essentially a romance novel. It's like the original Mills and Boon, you know, Cathy, girl, loves man, Heathcliff, hates girl, all that sort of stuff, but then man turns out actually to love girl in the first place. It's the original, like, romantic story. And that was written in 1840s, and by a woman. It was her only novel, Emily Bronte, and she lived in Yorkshire. I don't think she ever left Yorkshire. I don't think she ever left the Priory where she grew up. And again, this idea that can speak to me, right? In Bangkok, who grew up here, probably borrowed it from this library to read the first time. So I think there's just a lovely sense of not being alone when you can relate to certain characters or books.
Great. And Pim, what does it say to you, that quote?
Yes, I just want to echo what Emma said. It really makes you feel like less alone when you read something and you feel like someone is experiencing those emotions that you're experiencing, or just by reading what they're going through, you can identify what your feelings are through someone else's. And I think a great example of this is, I think, the novel Sarsi by Madeline Miller. It's one of my favorite novels. For those who don't know, it's an adaptation. No, it's like a retelling of a Greek myth, and it's about this woman who gets like banished on an island, and people just see her as a witch, and she had this like love affair with I forget his name. The guy who's traveling 12 years to get back home. He's played by
Odysseus.
Yes, him. I kept thinking of the actor in the Brad Pitt movie Troy instead. But yes, so I think when I grew up, when I was little, I think I was quite a lonely child. And even when, as an adult, I'm very fascinated. So I'm very fascinated by the concept of loneliness and isolation, especially female isolation and female loneliness. And when I read Sarsi, these like fantastical scenarios. Like at one point, a woman gets impregnated by a bull. Like it's a different kind of scenarios to what we're living now, obviously. And but I found so much kinship with that character, strangely, and the loneliness and the isolation that she faces in that novel, I find like super relatable. So it made me think, wow, this book that is based on a myth written like, I don't know, thousands of years ago, and it's set in a completely different world, different country, different universe. I find so much to connect to with that story. So I think that's what's amazing about books, and I think that's what's amazing about storytelling, and I think that's sort of reflects what Baldwin said.
And Edmund, can I ask you to respond to that quote? What does that bring up for you?
I don't quite know how to respond to that, because I read a lot. You know, I read a lot. You know, I can read 100 books a year. You know, if I'm not, I read a book every 3 days. I don't watch. I haven't been to the cinemas in years, you know, since my kids are grown up. I subscribed to Netflix when it everybody was telling me I should. And I watched Netflix, and after a year, I say, oh my God, I don't find, it's just quite boring after, so I stopped. So I just read, and I read now because I read lots of manuscripts as a publisher. I get 70 manuscripts submitted every year for our book prize, and of the 70, I will read maybe 20 in total, all the way through, and maybe the other 50 I would read maybe half of it or 1/3, depending on how good they are, right? And then the novels that are not published by me, I would read. And I read them because I want to be able to appreciate how well they are written, so that I can then tell my authors, look, can I refer you to a book? Can I refer to you to this passage that I've read? So my phone has got lots of annotations and from books that I read, and I don't have time to watch movies, and I find movies terrible, really terrible compared to a book. Right. So I just read, that's all. I don't do anything else.
So you brought up something, Pim, when you were talking about the way that Circe, in essence, contains the Odyssey, or at least retells the Odyssey. And Emma had raised a point when we started our dialogue about the way that books contain other books. And I was delighted when I was rereading Finding George Orwell in Burma that it contains so many books. It contains Orwell's Burma books. It contains books like The Old Man and the Sea. But very importantly, it also contains 1984. And I'd love for you to speak a little bit both about the topic of how books contain other books, and then very specifically how Finding George Orwell in Burma contains 1984.
Sure, thank you. There's a bit of a giveaway in that title, isn't there? There's no secret. Not to link everything back to the Neilson Hayes, but when I first had the idea for that book, I had read George Orwell's Burmese Days, and it occurred to me that not much had changed in Burma from the time he was there, and I wanted to know more about Orwell. I didn't really understand that he'd been in Burma. So I came here, and I got out a book called The Unknown Orwell by Peter Stansky and Bill Abrams. And it had one chapter on Burma. They had never been to Burma, but they'd written about that time and interviewed people who'd been there. And this sort of pre-internet days, and I based the whole structure and story, everything about the book was based on that one book. So that's actually the hidden book. Well, the Orwell books are the obvious books, right? But that's the hidden book within. And I was able, years later, to go meet Peter Stansky, actually, in LA, and thank him, because it enabled me to go on this great journey with Orwell. In the case of the obvious books, which is, there's a joke in Burma that Orwell didn't write just one book about Burma, which was his novel Burmese Days, but he wrote 3 books, which was Burmese Days, pertaining to the colonial era, Animal Farm, to the socialist era in Burma, and 1984 to what was then the current day military dictatorship, and sadly is now again. So I used that as a sort of conceit, if you like, to travel around and talk to people about books was actually the opening. I mean, Burma being a military dictatorship, quite hard sometimes just to walk up to strangers and start conversations. And books was a very easy way of doing it, actually, in the right crowd and circumstances,
Just as a follow-up to that, we started with how books can save a life, but there are certainly countries like and including Burma where books can end a life. And can you address that?
Yeah, I mean, in Burma, it gets confusing to me, Burma, because it used to be a kind of wonderful thing where you could talk about the military dictatorship in the past, but we, after a decade of quasi-democracy, we're now back in the same situation. But books are dangerous things in Burma, and in fact, even Orwell was a kind of samizdat literature in Burma. People were put in jail not for possessing Orwell's books, but for possessing other books that were much more threatening to the regime. So I think that probably shows the power of books, right? That this big old military dictatorship with all these guns can be afraid of, little pieces of paper that are circulating.
Thank you. Pim, I want to return, as I promised I would, to the topic of time travel and find out from you a little bit about why the time travel narrative appeals to you and something about the creation of this extraordinary novel.
Oh, thank you so much. So my book, The Moon Represents My Heart, is about a British-Chinese family of time travelers, just to give context. And I've always loved time traveling stories, and that's kind of strange because I don't read a lot of sci-fi. And when I was writing this novel, one of my mentors asked me, "Oh, do you want to read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time?" And I just went, "Nah." That's fine. But I read a lot and watched a lot of movies. I'm sorry, Admin, but I did something very criminal. I watched a lot of movies and TV shows that has time travel. And what I find I think the reason why I find time travel so fascinating is I think it's because it's human nature of us to look back on our own lives and our own past decisions, and sometimes we have regrets, or sometimes we think, oh, if one thing can happen, this, like, would our lives be different? Would our lives pan out differently? And I think time travel allows us to explore themes of loss and grief and regret, like, very well. Like, one of the main inspirations for my novel is Doctor Who, as you mentioned, and my two favorite Doctor Who episodes are this one called Blink with David Tennant and Carey Mulligan, and another one called Vincent and the Doctor with Matt Smith, and they go back in time to see Vincent van Gogh. And those two episodes are really about, like, loss and grief, and about basically the nature of time and how fast time goes. And I think those are the main reasons why time travel for the book is so much of the book is about loss. So I feel like time travel is, it fits.
Yeah, the loss is so palpable in it, and we were talking before the symbol of the Kowloon walled city, which is an important part of the novel, which is gone.
Yeah, I think it was demolished when Hong Kong was handed over to the British, I think, around that time. But yeah.
So, Edmund, back to your prodigious reading, which is, I'm a prodigious reader, but you are more so. One of the things that delighted and fascinated me from this weekend is you're showing me the way that you keep track of the books that you've read. And I'd love for you to talk about that for a moment.
Oh. When I start a book, I in my handphone, in my notes, I'll put the name of the author, the title of the book, and I'll put down the epigraph if there is one in the book, and then I'll have the opening line. And if there's a closing line, it means I finished reading the book. If there's no closing line, it means I didn't finish the book. Yeah. So I have hundreds and hundreds of these lines in my handphone. I think it's so important to start a novel with a memorable opening line. And great novels all have great opening lines. And I always tell my authors, please, we cannot have "It was a dark and stormy night." In whatever form, but they all do. I don't know why. They all start their novel by "It was a dark and stormy night." In other words, but it's the same thing, and I keep saying, please, And if they can't understand what's a good opening line, then I'll tell them, please go and read this. If you don't, here it is, it's in my phone, read this. And I think, I do that because I love the language. I grew up after the war. The British ruled Singapore. I went to an English-speaking school. I'm monolingual. I can't speak any other language. So I love the English language. And I you know, when it's well written, it's just, you know, lovely, and I love it. And so I show it to my authors, would-be authors. I say, look, this is how you, sometimes I write the opening line for them, and I say, if you can go and change it, but I think this is how you should start your novel.
That's marvelous. I think that should be offered as a service, an opening line service. Before we turn to questions from all of you, and I'm sure and hope you have many, I wanted to get some reaction to at least one other favorite quote. And I'm going to pull one from Azar Nafisi, reading Lolita in Tehran, a memoir in books. In all great works of fiction, regardless of the grim reality they present, there is an affirmation of life against the transience of that life, an essential defiance. This affirmation lies in the way the author takes control of reality by retelling it in his own way, thus creating a new world. So, Pim, can I start you off what your reaction is to that?
I feel like I should not have been looking at you so intently when you were reading that quote. Because now wow, I feel like I'm back in my English lit class. I think I'm trying to come up with something clever, but all I can think about is what Emma said about like books within books, and I think so much of what we do as writers or storytellers is that we sort of take life and I don't know what the right word is, maybe recycle it or repackage it in a way so that other people can experience those experiences or have their eyes be open to those experiences. And yeah, that's a great quote. I think that's all I have to say on that.
Well, I wasn't really listening because I was frantically trying to remember the first line of Comrade Eon's Field Guide to Bangkok and wondering.
I think it was a dark and stormy night, as I recall. No.
I would say very simply, I think messages in bottles, right? Books. You know, you send it out. You never know, like the postcards of Otto Quangle, you never know who's going to pick it up, why, for what reason, or what connection will be made. There's a surprising, when I published my first book, Finding George Orwell in Burma, I was surprised by that books have an afterlife. You know, you think the hard work is writing the book and getting it out there and doing the promoting, but for years afterwards, I had wonderful interchanges with people. For instance, I was invited to Japan to speak to the George Orwell Society of Japan, which is a really serious thing. There are all these guys who walk around with little leather elbow patches, and they grow vegetables and yams and things like Orwell did. And that would never have happened to me otherwise, right? You end up on a sort of an afterlife adventure of your book, which really surprised me, and I love it. It comes back in different, the messages in the bottle come back in different forms and lead me in different directions.
Right. Edmund, do you have a reaction to that?
So I think it encapsulates everything I believe in. You know, a book is so important. That's why I'm in publishing. Whenever I go to a school of secondary school in Singapore for students between 12 to 16, maybe 18, I always encourage them to become a writer, even though I know they will be very poor in Singapore. And I always, in the process of the talk, I always ask them, do you know in 1851, someone in America wrote a novel about a whale, big white whale. And I asked them, do you know, most of them will know that it's Moby Dick. And I've asked them, do you know who wrote it? The older ones maybe, and you'll get some names, and you maybe, a few of them will say Herman Melville, right? And I asked them, who was the president of America in 1851? Nobody will know. And I'm very sure even if I was to speak to an audience of American kids, nobody will know who was the president of America in 1851. And I say the same thing to them, that if you write a great novel in Singapore, that novel will live on forever. And 50 years from now, you will not know who is Goh Chok Tong. is, by the way, the second Prime Minister of Singapore. and again, Harry Potter, Moby Dick, you don't know who is the publisher. How many of you know who published Harry Potter? Not for authors, in the industry, but the public will never know who published Harry Potter, especially the person, the company you might know, right? And you will not know who published Moby Dick. You do not know who published Oliver Twist.
So you're like the invisible hero then, aren't you?
But if you didn't have the publisher, these books would never have come about. And publishers are very happy to be unrecognized and forgotten. And that's what I truly believe, right? And that's why when I tell my story of my life, and many people say, why don't you write it? Why don't you write a novel? If I write a novel, I will write one novel in 5 years, 3 years if I'm lucky. But I publish 50 books a year. So in 5 years, I would have produced 250 books instead of trying to write one book. So to me, that's why it's so important to be a publisher and not an author. To me, I'm glad there are authors around.
That's fantastic. And I am going to go and look up who was president in 1851. Do you know? What?
Do you not know?
No, I don't know.
No, I'm sure nobody will know.
That's great. It's a great example. So we have 10 minutes left, so we're going to turn to audience questions.
Edmund, I loved your anecdote about reading a book at the Singapore Grand Prix. I once read Gone with the Wind at the Melbourne Grand Prix. My question to the panel is, what was the last book that made you cry?
Tim, why don't you start us off?
Well, I can start because I just finished reading just about a week ago, The Covenant of Water. I don't know if any of you read it. It's a huge book, 750 pages. Abraham Verghese, Cutting for Stone, the tennis partner, his previous books. Covenant of Water is set in the state of Kerala in India. It's across three generations. And the family has a genetic disease that makes them, there's always one person from each generation that gets drowned. It sounds odd, but it happens. And so the granddaughter is trying to find out what happens. But it's a great family drama, slightly, I call it mama drama. It's slightly, Bollywood, but at the end, I don't cry easily, but it did bring some tears to my eyes. I recommend you to read it. And I think there's another recommendation I like to suggest to everyone who loves reading. You must read one book that is more than 1,000 pages. One book a year. Every year you must read one book that is 7 to 1,000 pages, so that you exercise your mind.
Great. Pim, the last book that made you cry.
I cry easily, so I have 3. So the first is All My Rage by Sabah Tahir. I might butcher all these names. She wrote this YA trilogy, like it's called the Ambers in the Ashes series, and she's wrote, this is her first kind of like modern, kind of contemporary novel. It's amazing, made me cry. Another book, I don't think these two are on sale in Thailand because I tried to look. One is one of my author friends, Elvin James Mensah. So he wrote a book, and his debut novel is called Small Joys. And that one is about friendship and how the small things in life and how the small moments with your friend can save you. And that's amazing. And another one is called Someday Maybe, by a British Nigerian author. Her name is Onyi Nwabile. I'm pretty sure I butchered that pronunciation. But yes, these 3 books.
Great. And Emma?
I would say very simply that all the books I've mentioned probably did make me cry at one point or another.
And I know that the question wasn't asked of me, but I'm going to answer anyways. The last book that made me cry, I finished over the weekend, and it was written by the panelist to my left.
Thank you. That's very good.
Another question, please. Oh, there we go.
Hello. Thanks for your speech, everyone. Thanks for being here. I was wondering, when you look back on your life, where do you think your passion for reading comes from? You know, a lot of us, it comes from our parents or some program or activity or maybe a particular book we read when we were young. I'm a teacher, and I have students who don't have that passion. And so I'm curious to know, is this because of a difference in parenting, or are there other factors at play? Like, where does that come from for some of you?
Yes.
How about the current generation? Online game, internet, taking so much of our children's times.
Great. So I'm going to throw it to Pim first, and can you answer both of those? That would be great. Because they're related. They're closely related.
When I was younger, I think when I was very little, my dad would read to me from these like children's stories. I think that was a big part of it, and he would tell me stories that he make up himself. So I think that's a big part. And another, I remember this very clearly. I think what helps with reading is finding something that they're interested in and using that as a gateway. Because I remember very clearly, I wanted to watch The Lord of the Rings when it came out, like the movie Fellowship of the Rings. I think I was 7 or 8. And my parents were kind of concerned that I would get scared because of the orcs and stuff. And so they was like, oh, try reading it first. So they got me this like translation, like Lord of the Rings in Thai. So I think that was a big reading moment for me, that reading the original like Lord of the Rings really opened my world up to books.
And piggybacking on Andreas's question, what about the competition today with online, and do you worry about the future of young readers?
I think people's attention, because of the internet, like you said, our attention span has become like way shorter. But I do think loads of people still read. But I think people, because of like younger people, I don't know if I'm young, but I think what I keep coming back to this. I think what our interests and our passions are good gateway to reading. And this might be a terrible example, but the new Britney Spears book, lots of the people on the internet are talking about it. They're like reels, they're TikTok, they're like viral tweets on it, little like audiobook snippets. And I think if, for example, like if a young person listen to it online and say, oh, that's interesting, let me go get the book. That's another pathway that young people can access books as well.
Marvelous. Emma, do you have anything to add?
My mother's sitting right here. I was wondering if...
Oh, yay.
No, she won't want to say anything. For me, I think it's very particular circumstances. I'm an only child, and I think books was just where I turned to for company. And as we were talking about that lonesome, no longer feeling. I think one sort of publication phenomenon would be the Harry Potter books, which subverted that, right? They're big books, too, right? Hundreds and hundreds of pages long. People...
5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, it's
quite small.
And book 1, 2, 3 didn't sell until book 4.
Well, Edmund, if you could pick up your microphone, I'm going to ask you to because we've got a couple minutes left, but the question about the next generation, you're a publisher, as am I. Obviously, keeping people engaged in reading and raising a new generation of readers is vital. And what's your perspective?
No, I just ignore everything that everybody is saying about the internet, the e-book, and I just publish it. I don't give a damn whether they want to read or not. I just publish because I know books are important. Talking about what get people to read. I mean, as I said, I grew up after the war. There was no books around. when I left Singapore for university in New Zealand, was the first time I had left the country, the first time I had flown in a plane. I got to New Zealand, I was really fresh off the boat. You know, I was given a list of books to read. Oh, okay, but you know, being a Singaporean, I was a hardworking student. So I read all the books I was assigned to read, you know, not because I had read a lot when I was young or, you know. So I read and I found one book that changed my life, changed everything I ever thought about life. And so I continued reading because I wanted to find the next book. And I think it will be the same with your students if you don't force them. I mean, this year I started reading Moby Dick. And when I went back to the office to talk to my staff, they all complained about what a terrible book it was. We were forced to read it when we were at university, you know, and they say it's such a terrible book. And I say, oh my God, you know, it is such a beautiful book. It's so profound. And really, you need to read it when you're 70 years old, not when you're 17. So I think the books will find the right, you know, if you don't force them, they'll find the right things and yeah.
And Emma, did you have something to add to that?
Well, I just had a question, actually. I was, you know, on the topic of this panel, we've corresponded and chatted a bit leading up to this. And I'm just curious, for you, you've written very eloquently about books and reading, and I wonder if you think that books can save lives.
I do think that books can save lives, and I think they can save lives in two ways. One is they save the life we have, that we're a different reader at the end of every book than we were at the beginning. So the us that exists today contains all the books that we've read. But I also believe that the right book at the right time, whether it tells someone they're not alone or inspires them to cross the world in search of new horizons, or even a self-help book gives them the piece of advice they need, can quite literally save a life. So, thank you. And now I'm going to ask you one more time because to put your hands together for Pim Wangtechawat, for Edmund Wee, and for Emma Larkin, and for the marvelous books they wrote and published.
And for Will, too.
Thank you very much to all our speakers for such an interesting and exciting discussion.